The challenge that we're having is the fact that the fiscal space is very tight, but we have to spend because the opportunity cost of not spending at this time could be greater. And I think it's very important that the government looks at the return on investment in every single dollar that they're spending in this next budget. So for me, I think the most critical trade-off in this budget is how do we manage expenditure to be able to, or how does the Minister of Finance, let me put it this way, how does the Minister of Finance use all the levers that she has, that being direct expenditure, but also policy and regulation, etc., across the entire banking and non-banking financial system to actually achieve the goals that have been lagging for the last 20 plus years in order for us to ensure that we're not just spending for comfort and to kick the can down the road, but spending so that in 10 years' time we're actually able to achieve lasting growth. So I think in that, the key things would obviously be your education, but not only education, working on creating an entrepreneurial mindset so that we can create more jobs. Right now, I've noticed that what the Minister of Finance is doing or has done in the previous budget is focusing a lot of youth unemployment, but thinking more in terms of just giving people initial experiences with internships and etc. But the country needs more CEOs and not more interns because one CEO can create a lot of permanent jobs. So I think ensuring that the minister is able to do that without directly using or directly straining the fiscal budget would be the key for this budget for me.
Jesaya, can I move over to you?
Yes.
On the side.
Yeah.
On the side.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's really the balance between how much do you spend on your capital budget and how much you spend obviously on human resources, which is very static, right? So now we have this static human resource budget, which is growing every year. Unfortunately, the government has been using employment through government or public service to kind of try to alleviate unemployment in the country. I mean, if you look at it, Namibia is one of the probably the highest civil servant to non-civil servant employment ratios globally. And obviously, it's because we just haven't gotten it right. How do we get employment right in Namibia? It's something I think even private sector many times not getting right. So that's just the balance to say, okay, are we going to employ more people? Are we going to give more money to basically capital projects to grow the economy? But even with capital projects, we've heard that implementation is very, very poor. All right, so then you actually give a lot of money to capital projects, implementation get done. Obviously, the money or the budget returns to treasury. So that, to me, that is one of the biggest kind of trade-offs the government will to make. Okay, make sure that we have enough money in capital projects, but make sure that at the same time you are able to meet your civil service budget, and obviously knowing that we are probably going to get more soldiers next year and more police people next year, because it seems like it's a recurring kind of recruitment process going on, as well as more teachers, I'm assuming more nurses and doctors, and so it goes. So I don't, as much as the government is saying they are freezing employment, those 4 areas I mentioned now, seems like every year is going up, and it means that more money needs to be spent in those particular budget items.
Floris, please share with us your views.
Risha, yes, I just want to, if I may, firstly just drop a word of caution perhaps, or perspective to say that yes, we're discussing fiscal policy and developmental policy and what the government does and don't do and all that, but we must be careful not to be overly dependent on what government does. It is important, like Salomo pointed out, the importance of policy and the administrations and the philosophies, etc. However, we well, most of us in the private sector, so we need to set our sails to whatever way the wind blows. And I think perhaps there's a sense that's gotten hold of society in general, that the government must do everything to right the ship, so to speak, with all of these unemployment numbers, etc., etc. Now, what Salomo said is the important thing is to have certainty with regards to policy, but I also think more than certainty, you need to have good policy first, and then certainty. You can have a bad policy and that also brings certainty, but that means nothing happens. Yes, so back to the trade-off. From my point of view, and from where I work and sit, is we approach the budget largely from a overall macroeconomic perspective. So what matters first of all are the big numbers, the headline numbers, and what we have had over the last fiscal year. We really had a very tight situation in the capital markets with respect to government finances, and specifically with respect to the deficit and what was needed to fund the deficit as well as the maturities. So last year was the fiscal year now ending, actually now in March 26 is the end of the fiscal year, was the biggest borrowing requirement ever in the market. So that is one of the key things for me then in terms of a trade-off, is we have to get a trade-off between fiscal sustainability, fiscal health, and big promises, big plans, big spending plans. That sounds very good, and yes, we need to spend and all that, but we also need to have, in terms of the trade-off, I think what I would like to hear from the Minister and the administration in general is a very, very keen awareness of the resources that are available. If you think about our economy is about 300 billion, more or less, in size. The government revenue is roughly 90 billion. The spending side for this year is around about 105 billion. So we normally have a deficit of about 15 billion. And last year that was about the deficit, but then with the maturities, we needed to borrow about 25 odd billion. So the market, so to speak, is not an amorphous entity out there. The market consists of you and me, your funds, my funds, your savings, our savings, the bank's assets, which are your deposits. Well, your deposit is actually the bank's liabilities, let me correct me there. But the banks also fund the government, the deficit. Now, it's not a bad thing to have a deficit. A deficit establishes the cost of capital in the economy as a whole, because the government borrows at certain rates, right? That establishes like an interest rate structure in the market, where the rest of the economy then needs to compete with. Because if you want to lend money, you invest money, you lend money, you want to lend to the lowest risk at the best rate. And if you can do it to government, then the next guy that comes, stands in line, wants to borrow in the market, he has to pay up above that. So what the government does with its finances is a very important benchmark for the cost of capital in the economy. Monetary policy does play a role on the short end, but totally cost of capital, that's the thing. So there is, I hope my trade-off is clear between sustainability and spending too much.
Thank you, Floris. Well, Salomo, you've obviously alluded to a number of those trade-offs in your presentation. However, in your view, what would you regard as the single most critical trade-off facing the minister?
I think for me really is that policy certainty around the investment, promotion and facilitation. If you look at the past 2 to 3 years, we have had a huge influx of FDI, even if it was on the exploration side, which is more capital intensive. The reality is that we are moving to the next phase now. And these sectors need to have some level of certainty around what is local content. We need to have certainty around what subsectors within the oil and gas will accrue to Namibians in relation, and it's notwithstanding perhaps the skills or the lack of skills we don't have in them. But I think it's important that the minister speaks to this. Again, the issue around the petroleum bill, amendment bill that's coming. Again, you really want to make sure that whatever is done will stand the test of time. Will stand the test of time in the context that what necessitated it to move out of the ministry, and why is it now going somewhere else? Because you want to have that certainty so that you don't have an NIPDB is here today, tomorrow it's gone. We speak about corporate governance in terms of all our economic plans. We go SOE reforms. The next thing, the Ministry of Public Enterprises doesn't exist. What is that? So the reality is, once you've got that policy certainty around your key economic activities, I think everyone signs up. I hear Floris say that you also need not only policy certainty, you also need good policies. But I think even in countries where there's war, there are investors. And the policy certainty there is war. So you need them so that you know which investors are ready to sign up for that. Because in the absence of that, they don't sign up. Thank you.
Salomo, I want to remain with you. And again, going back to your presentation, billions are allocated to development, yet execution rates remain weak. Is Namibia's development challenge really about money, or is it about competence?
Yeah, good question. So I think that, and really, and I hope you followed the thought process through the presentation. That our development plans, in terms of the narrative, don't change. Just words change. So let's look at the development budget in its execution. Nekatal Dam is a development budget project, right? You invest, you allocate, you build the dam. The dam is currently at full capacity, but it's not being fully utilized. The green schemes are capital projects. You invest heavily in them, you don't demand a return on that investment. So whether it's competency, whether it's the feasibility that informs the project to be undertaken, and perhaps the research component really of how government goes about arriving at a particular development budget need to be looked at. The national oil storage facility, I think we read the other day that it's being underutilized or it's not having sufficient throughput. Big national project again. So perhaps Honorable Minister of Finance will project pipeline and then allocate feasibility research grants, if it were, to that process, so that you don't only build the dam, but you also build the dam with knowing what you want to do with the dam.
So if projects repeatedly fail readiness tests, should Treasury then simply refuse to fund them?
Remember that Treasury approves the funding. So Treasury should do or carry out the due diligence on the approval on the funding. Because remember that the respective ministries present to Treasury what their capital project needs are for the medium term, the next 3 years. And through that, Treasury then is bound to a due diligence in terms of what is the life of the project, how do you intend, what are the potential off-takers, what are the potential costs, when does this project goes into the J curve, when does the project become, where's the equilibrium of this project from a cash flow perspective, and. So I think there's more work that needs to be done there to be able to make sure that not only is it not executed, but once it's executed, there's actually an outcome at the end of the day.
So would you, in your view, would you support freezing new capital projects until feasibility and procurement readiness standards are met?
Well, I think Helena spoke about there's a greater risk of freezing due to the challenges that we have. I would rather propose that we do it correctly as opposed to freezing it. And when I say correctly, having the necessary due diligence carried out to the point that a project is not only completed once the dam is physically there, but what is the intention once it's there.
We are told Namibia has savings, yet entrepreneurs struggle for funding. And here, Helena, I want to turn to you. Is the banking sector too risk averse? Or are SMEs simply just not investment ready?
That's also a good question, Michelle. I think it's a bit of both, but I think structurally more the latter. What I mean by that is if you look at if you remember the GDP graph that Salomo presented, since the period of no growth in 2016, the banking sector has definitely seen a notable increase in NPLs, which are non-performing loans, which have remained sticky, right? So despite the fact that growth has recovered, the banking sector has not seen a material decrease in your default risk. So from that perspective, for them to be risk averse in this economy makes sense from a data perspective, right? On the other hand as well, structurally, again, if you remember Salomo's presentation, you have such a high youth unemployment rate, you have low incomes, and you're sitting in a space where in order for you to be eligible for commercial banking credit, you essentially need some sort of experience or some sort of income to be able to service that debt. But structurally, a lot of Namibians just simply do not have that. And therefore, they essentially are unprepared. And that's why I think what has been the talk of the town for the last couple of years has been, what can we do across the financial sector in the asset management space, but perhaps Namibia needs to create a culture of venture capitalism and etc. that will then allow us to take on the risk of investing in these entrepreneurs without risking the financial stability of the entire financial system. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the financial stability is what is driving investment to our country, and it is what is supporting growth at the end of the day. So it is a bit of both, but I do think that government should look at or the ministry should look at, instead of looking at just the commercial banking, which traditionally and by its design is for more mature projects that are already generating some sort of revenue, how can we use the larger savings in order to unlock potential and sort of take on longer term risk and have Namibians sort of invest in themselves in another way?
So bluntly, Helena, is the capital there, but the pipeline weak?
100%. The capital is there. I think if you look at the, as Floris mentioned, the size of the economy, the size of the financial system, and even if you look at on the asset management side, the fact that we see our largest pension funds investing in infrastructure projects, we just don't see that same investment coming in for a smaller entrepreneur. And even though in the alternative space, as Salomo alluded to the J-curve, their mandates do allow them to take on a little bit more risk in the beginning of the project and allow the entrepreneur to sort of gain that experience and generate that revenue and eventually pay people back or pay the fund back in the long run. So I think the capital is there, but because of the economic challenges that we've been experiencing, there is almost a mismatch in the economy, and that's a structural problem, which is why policy and regulatory reform to me is the answer.
So would tax incentives then for venture capital genuinely unlock investment or merely subsidize activity that would have happened anyway?
I think to Floris's point about good and bad policies, it's really about the right tax incentives, right? And actually creating an incentive for the private sector to want to do that. Because again, venture capital inherently is very risky capital. So you would have to give me some sort of an incentive to take that on. But again, given the issues that we're having from an unemployment, education, and just where we are from a youth mindset perspective, the culture of entrepreneurship is also just generally not formalized enough. So whatever incentives we try and change or try to implement, it's important that we have some sort of measure to the incentives, so we can always be changing and adopting those incentives. So for example, the tax incentives for internships. How many of the companies have actually taken up those tax incentives? And also how many of those jobs actually then eventually turn into permanent jobs? Because it's a great initiative, but if you're not measuring how many of those jobs actually turn into permanent jobs, and you're not measuring whether the uptake, whether the private sector is actually appetized to take up that incentive, then it is also just essentially a form of fiscal spending that is not generating the ROI that you would want at the end of the day.
Jesaya, let me turn to you. Public procurement is one of the largest economic levers available. Should government be willing to pay more in the short term to build domestic manufacturing capacity?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Shay. But I think let's take a seat back and just look at the bigger picture, right? Right now, Namibia is sitting at about a 37% unemployment rate. When we look at the broader unemployment rate, it sits at 55%. Youth unemployment sits at 44%, and if broad unemployment rate is 55%, just look at the youth broad unemployment rate, probably around more than 50, say 60%, going to 70%. Not 75%, I think Salomo had a slide on that. See, now, given that, right, and then we're talking about, Salomo said 70% of, when we look at our structure of our economy, sits in the secondary sector, much of it sits in tertiary sector. We talk about manufacturing sitting in that secondary sector. And now, we also say government doesn't have money, perhaps, to put more money in the economy, right? So that they're constrained that way. But one thing is for sure, government will spend every year, right? So government procurement perhaps is one of those levers that we can use to really help build our economy, right? So yes, basically that's the answer to your question. we need more local procurement spent by government within the manufacturing sector. Maybe looking at increased preference for local manufacturers. So obviously there's the reason, right? You can't just have a price, 4 or 5 times what you can import. But if you are able to support local manufacturers who create local jobs, that is one way we can definitely decrease unemployment in the country, especially when you look at the GDP structure in this country, where you look at government spending as one of the largest contributors to GDP. So yes, and obviously then that will then also lead to more consumption within the country. When you look at the GDP formula. So I think for me, it makes sense that government does that.
Does localization risk entrenching inefficiency and rent seeking?
Again, as I said, there has to be a balance between the two, right? So one cannot pay 4 or 5 times what you can do to if you can import, but if it's maybe 1.5 times the price of the import price, and perhaps that's a price given our small economy and given the demand and supply considerations in the country. Obviously, if someone is set up manufacturing here, cannot be compared to manufacturing in China, because Chinese manufacturers have economies of scale. They're able to produce at lower prices than Namibian manufacturers. But if the balance can be found between someone who's rent seeking and someone who's just making a good enough profit, given where they are given the constraints within the economy, then yes, I do believe that government should pay a bit more, but not excessively more.
So what would you say, where does patriotism end and economic distortion begin?
Very good question. Again, as I said, let's perhaps do. That's why I talked about a preference margin before. Let's look at a reasonable preference margin, right? Where if a price is maybe, let's say, 30 to 40% more, all right, as compared to an imported price, then you can say, okay, maybe we can procure that. But if you look at, and it's, let's say, it's 60, 70, twice, 3, 4 times than what the import price is, then perhaps that's where you say, no, preferentism has to end here, and let's be economically rational, because at the end of the day, this is just basically, Namibian entrepreneurs stealing from the pot.
Thank you, Jesaya. Floris, I'm going to turn to you. There is capital seeking yield, and there are infrastructure needs. Now, if Namibian PPPs were truly bankable, institutional investors would fund them. So, what is really the problem? Is it policy uncertainty? Is it regulatory risk? Or is it political hesitation?
Yeah, I think we do have a good regulatory framework for PPPs. There's an act, I think 2017 act. And there was a unit created, I think under the Harambee plan, called the Public-Private Partnership Unit, that was supposed to evaluate projects and bring them to the table, so to speak. So I do think we've got the regulations. I do think, though, that we've got the age-old problem of the mandates of capital, right? So we as asset management business, or the industry, I should say, basically run the investment plans on the basis of mandates that we get from the members of a fund. So there's always been this problem of a mismatch between the nature of the capital that's available and the mandate it's got, and the demand for capital. I think Helena referred to that as well, the type of capital, and venture capital that type of thing. So I think the developments that we've had with the unlisted investment initiative, where we had a regulation brought in where pension funds had to have a minimum investment in unlisted, right? And you can actually, there's a band, you can increase your unlisted investments. So now we've got a formal structure where asset management businesses or whomever can register as an unlisted manager and then approach pension funds and say, that is what we do, give us some funds and we'll manage it for you on your behalf. And then they give you the funds with a mandate, what you are to do with the funds. So that makes it, that frees you up in your decision-making process to say, well, I can look at this menu of investments. And I must say, I think we've been really reasonably successful in funding smaller businesses in the unlisted space, right? So the trouble is where we've got now three, thank you, thanks. We've got three streams now converging here. You've got your political developmental imperative. You've got your fiscal policy, and you've got portfolio management as a specialization. So you've got to go get these three things running together. So the trouble is, coming back to the Salomo's war analogy, and the policy certainty, good and bad policy and all that. The another problem of that dimension of the way you have got the political stream is it's a short cycle. So there's little continuity, right? So you can add that as another type of policy imperative we need to have is continuity, so that plans carry through political cycles, so that the investor can also look through the next administration, or the next president, or the next whomever is coming down the pipe. And perhaps we need also to have a regulation to say that pension funds or insurance funds or unit trusts with the right sort of types of mandates are now mandated to invest in infrastructure, right, in PPPs. Now, having this third leg here, the portfolio management specialization, infrastructure funding is even more specialized. It's very difficult to make the sums work. And we do not have in Namibia really a culture of user pay, right? User pay is usually what you need to have when you build a toll road. You know, people need to pay to use the road. People don't want that. That's politically not on here. And that is mostly what you do in PPPs. You have to have a user pay arrangement. Now, there's been some things happening in Namibia that you can maybe throw out under the PPP banner. The airports company, perhaps the things that been done at airports and the concessions on the concession arrangements, the Namport funding for the terminal. Okay, that wasn't private, it was public funding as well as concessional funding. So, but there's combinations of different investors. So that's been happening, and we had this the independent power producers that now all over the place producing green electricity, I should say, as Ampel as the final buyer. So that's a type of a partnership, so things can happen that way. but it's very difficult to get to reconcile these different streams of let's call them specialization.
So would you commit pension fund capital to large-scale PPP infrastructure under current conditions?
No, not at the moment. For pension fund or investor, it's too illiquid. It's an illiquid investment of a long horizon with big risk. So it needs to be in a pooling, let's call it pension funds pooling together in another fund, perhaps a fund issuing bonds to the market that fund the fund that does this type of investment. That would be, in my view, the best way to go.
Thank you. I just want to pause for a moment and focus on education and human capital, which remains one of the largest areas of expenditure, yet outcomes lag. Helena, if I can turn this question to you, how critical is skills alignment to Namibia's diversification ambitions?
I think it's critical and it's actually foundational. I think one of the main reasons why Namibia has not been able to properly realize the economic benefit of the relatively stable growth that we have seen compared to the rest of Africa is that partially we don't have the skills to sort of keep the profits and the benefits in Namibia. A lot of times we see that there's foreign leaders or foreign people that are leading and earning or getting the higher paying jobs, whereas Namibians are more at the operational level and etc. And something like that essentially means a Namibian does not have the skill to go and start their own firm and start and really, Namibianize certain industries, even if we wanted to. But other than skill, again, it brings me back to my point of regulation, because if you look at something that is less technical and really based off of talent and skill that the government is also looking at investing in for the youth, which is the creative industry, without the right regulations, even if you are as talented as a South African, you do not have access to monetize that talent because regulation prevents you from accessing certain gateways. So it is a combination of both, but for me, I think it's very important that the government or the ministry looks at regulations, and then the private sector looks at how do we develop the skill, develop the entrepreneurial mindset with business development and etc. to really put the two together and then see long-term benefit. But it's not something that you would be able to necessarily do in the short term. To Salomo's point about long-term budgeting and long-term thinking, we have to take the mindset of maybe 5 to 10 year plans that we're executing, and irrespective of the political administration, there has to be national agendas and national goals that we're able to run towards and achieve and prioritize as a stable part of the budget, because that is the only way you will actually realize the actual return on investment. Otherwise, you do have lost capital.
Salomo, should education funding be tied more explicitly to measurable performance indicators?
Absolutely. To the extent that what graduates, in which disciplines are the graduates coming through? Do we know how many graduates came from UNEM in the economics department? I see that NAST is opening an auctionery now. So the inability to track that critical mass of the skills that sit in these graduates, obviously also it doesn't create the pipeline in terms of throughput for the industries that we have or for the industries that we don't have. And if you look at research, on top of your head, I don't know who in this room can name more than 5 research firms in this country. And anywhere in the world, research is at the cutting edge of new ideas. People don't want to pay for research in Namibia because they feel we know this stuff ourselves. I mean, what do you want to research? So this is the reality, which takes you that even you go to the science fields again, the engineers that we are putting through, given what's happening in Lutherans and all of this. So it's critical to have that filter around who's coming through, where are they, and what could potentially, and where could they potentially be placed over time. Because in the absence of that, you have this unemployment problem, you can't target it, your interventions is also very general, and where the world is moving is that you cannot bring solutions through common sense. I mean, there needs to be some level of scientific methodology around solutions, because everyone has got common sense and not everyone can solve problems.
Yeah, there's obviously a number of questions, and I mean the discussion can carry on and on, but we would also like to give the floor to our audience for questions. Before I turn to our audience, we also know that Namibia faces rising social welfare demands alongside tax base pressures. Are we politically honest about what we can afford? Is broadening the tax base politically realistic? Or are we approaching the ceiling of tax tolerance? And this is a question open to my panel. Anyone who wants to tackle that one?
What's that last word? Tax tolerance.
Tax tolerance.
I think the tax burden on individuals in Namibia and companies also is tolerable, but mainly due to the fact that we have such a big SACU income. Now, SACU is tax on economic activity, yes, granted. However, I don't think we feel it so much directly. So, if there a problem develops there in SACU revenue, then we are running into an intolerable situation, because that will no doubt will lead to tax hikes. VAT, income tax, we will soon get a wealth tax and the estate duties tax and all sorts of taxes, because I think that's one thing that governments do well. So we can talk about development plans failing and all that, but taxing, they're good at that.
Anyone else from the panel want to tackle that one before we open the floor for questions?
I mean, I'll give it a shot. I agree with Floris that definitely SACU revenue, or the sustainability of tax revenue, is really regionally dependent because of the SACU. But if you look at the domestic taxes as well, given the structure, again, going back to the fact that you don't have people creating more jobs to give you more income tax, and you're not seeing necessarily the average Namibian spending more to have more indirect tax, then of course we will get to a point, if we do not fix the structural problems, we will get to a point where we cannot collect more tax revenue. And then that takes you back to Salomo's point in this presentation, where we might end up like our neighbor in South Africa, where we're actually paying out more in grants than we're receiving in tax. And that's, again, why it becomes so important to not look at, what can we do to spend now to make us comfortable, but truly underlying what are the structural issues in our economy, because at the rate that we're going, we will get to a point where we will not be able to collect enough tax to cover our expenses if we do not fix those underlying structural issues of why tax base is not growing fast enough.
Thank you. I'm going to open our floor to questions now, and just a few brief guidelines. Let's please keep our questions concise. Kindly state your name and organization, and direct your question to a specific panelist where possible. We encourage pointed substantive agreement. So do we have any questions? Remember that budgets affect households, it affects businesses, it affects investment, it affects confidence. So yes, let's make this count. I see that we have a hand there at the back. If we do have a roving microphone for the lady at the back, yes, thank you. Kindly state your name and organization and to whom your question is directed.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Salomo. I don't really have a question directed to anybody specifically. Would be necessary, but I'm going back to the question of youth unemployment. It's just, I'm just wondering, like, if let me just come. Okay.
It's okay.
But I saw the graph that Mr. Salomo, I hope I pronounce your name right, shared with us, and it showed that from the ages of 15 to 35, the youth unemployment rate is very high, and then from the ages of 40 upwards, then that's when the graph really looks like it's productive. Now, my question is, how do we, it's just a suggestion, what if we involve everybody? Like, what sense does that make? Like, you see how the nurses, the teachers get to practice what they're learning in class. So you have, when you reach second year, you go out in the real world. But as for an economist or as an accounting student, you wait until third year and then you get exposed to the real world. As a developing country, we want everybody to be involved because we get free education. But what do we give back? The only time we give back, I feel, is when we graduate. So I'm wondering if everybody, like maybe let me say, second year, we all introduce the students to go out in the real world. Because we're already getting free education, we might as well do it for free. We get exposed to everything. You get like maybe second semester, we get a number of people, we take them to the real world, and then we all get exposed. By the time we reach third year, we are all familiar with exactly what we have to do and how it's going to benefit the country. So my question is just, how will that look like if we implement that? Instead of just giving out free education and more graduates. And then by the time somebody graduates, they already know what they're supposed to do, how it's going to benefit the economy, and then we work from there, instead of just waiting for the attention.
I think you've partially already answered yourself as well. Some great suggestions that you've presented there. Thank you for your contribution. We'll take a few more questions. The gentleman here in the front, and then the gentleman behind him. Right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Franz. I think perhaps the question is to Mr. Hay and also Mr. Floris. I hear from you a lot of this aspect of policy certainty. I'm trying to understand within our regime, is it understandable that we have a shortage of policy certainty? If you can just maybe react to that. Because I don't believe that is the real issue. But then the aspect of understanding all these compound issues that we have, unemployment, inequality. Now, to what extent, if the proposition is this, we have this policy certainty, affect or contribute to this animal that we have in the country. So I'm just trying to understand how does that fit within the whole trade-off? Because I don't want us, the conversation also to trade off ourselves within the conversation that we are having. So I just want something to relate to that. Thank you.
Okay, Frans, at the moment, I think we actually in a twilight zone sort of now, because the policy uncertainty that we refer to, one is specifically to do with the oil and gas opportunity that's out there, and there are legal reviews and things going on about how to manage this new opportunity, and people are taking too long to make their minds up on the Petroleum Act that Salomo referred to, and they want to put in too many requirements and provisions, and then you must do this and that and this and that before you are allowed to drill for oil. By the time you've done this and that and this and that, it's uneconomical. So that's just one sort of piece of the puzzle. But there are other, let's call it legislative issues that are unresolved, like the Investment Promotion Act. That's a critical one, because it's a bad piece of legislation, and it's very disjointed. It's just like it was quickly thrown together overnight someplace. And there's an agenda behind that that I do not trust. It comes from some dark corner, if I may be so blunt. Then you've got the NEP, the new economic empowerment, black empowerment legislation that's been hanging now for how long? It's not finalized. There is the FIM Act. The FIM Act is the Financial Institution Act. That's now sort of implemented, but we're waiting for regulations of how it's going to work and all that sort of thing. So it's at the moment. Then we also have the new administration have restructured all the ministries. They reshuffled, restructured from 21 to 14, right? So it's been broken apart and put together again. And there's been huge reshuffling in the SOEs of the personnel there. You follow? So it's just at this point in time, there's a lot of balls in the air that we don't know where they're going to land. But you are right in the sense that I don't know how Namibia actually survived the last 35 years with the types of structural problems we've had. And here's a thought, the development plans, I think I agree with Salomo, it's more or less the same story over and over. I think it's time to evaluate the results. What was the results we've been getting? Yes, no, good, maybe. Shall we stop doing this, or shall we do more, or, it's like,
Thank you, Floris. Salomo, would you like to briefly respond to that?
Thank you, Roche. Yeah, thank you, Franz. I think mine is really around a decision being made. I mean, I'm not an expert like Floris around legislation, whether this one is good or whether this one is bad. Essentially, what I want is we cannot have a legislation that doesn't come. So, is it NEF or is there no NEF? Right? It's as simple as that. Take the thing off the table or put it on. And I'll give you an example of the visa regime. Right? The visa regime, when you want to travel to Schengen, the Schengen area, you go sit, I don't know, I haven't traveled in a while, but the last time I went, I had to make an appointment at the German embassy for 3 weeks. You come after 3 weeks, you get your appointment, your bank statement is not correct, go back, go work another 3 months, come back, your bank statement is fine, now you can travel, right? You want to travel to the Schengen area and you want to travel to Germany, so what do? You fix that. The Namibian visa regime was introduced. Everyone kicked and shouted about this visa regime. If you want to come to safari in Namibia, you will align to that visa regime. So for me, this is what we need to move towards. Make a decision. Because if you don't make that decision, I think Floris and everyone else is more worried to the extent that if you are in grade 12 today or grade 1, you hope to get to grade 2 because that's progression. That's a certainty that you want. So, and in the absence of that, we'll just remain, it's bad, don't do that. There's a dog behind the tree in the dark corner, someone else is doing what. So it will continue like that. Make the decision and let's live with it, And I think decisions around policy, if they are informed, for instance, I don't know, sorry, Lucia, maybe I'm taking a lot of time, but I think let me make this point. You've got what they refer to as the EPLs, right? The exclusive prospecting licenses. We have a template where government and the private sector came together and did very well with De Beer, right? Because they built a world-class institution. Deb Marine localized, they are run by Namibians and anything. So that's a template where there's a proper shareholding between private sector and government. I don't know what the issue is. And if you are saying you are putting in 23% for Namibia, why are you putting it in there? You need to explain that. Are you putting it in there because you saw what happened with Deb Marine and De Beer? Or are you putting it in there because it must only come to Salomo? But in the absence of that, we all guessing. And this is why Floris is saying that people are doing things in the dark corners because there's simply no decision coming. Bring the decision and people will align with it.
Thank you. In the interest of...
I withdraw that statement.
It's too late, of course. In the interest of time, I see 4 more hands. Again, we kindly request, keep your question concise. Please introduce yourself by way of your name and the organization you represent and who your question is directed at. I remember we had a gentleman at the back there. Yes, sir. We'll take 3 more questions and then we'll conclude our discussion. We've got quite a number of hands. It seems like we all have time still. I just want to ensure that we're still good with time. Okay. Can we have your question very briefly?
Okay. Good evening. My name is Vitalio Angula. I'm a freelance journalist, but I'm here in my capacity as a philosopher. I've got a question on education for Mr. Salomo on education not returning value for money. So my question is, how are you calculating value for money? And does education not return value for money, or are you making the mistake of looking at value for money through the lens of short-term government budgets? I would just like to say that in the long term, money spent on education leads to higher lifetime earnings, which result in more tax revenue in the future. It also contributes to lower crime rate, which also contributes to lower justice costs and also better health, meaning lower healthcare spending. For example, the majority of people today who find ourselves in the prison system are people who do not even have a grade 8 high school education. So that trade-off of the investment in our education system, does it not pay off socially? When you look at health education, something as simple as using a condom or birth control requires a degree of education to understand. So we need to incorporate social return on investment when talking about return on investment. Just a bit of advice. The education ecosystem also drives the economy in ways that are not always measurable. For example, the transport for children to go to school in the morning, the taxis, the staffing requirements for the education system, the teachers, the cleaners, the infrastructure development for the construction industry, uniform manufacturing, catering for school hostels. These are all economies which benefit from having an education system which we invest in heavily.
Do
Then
you
I will
have your final question, sir? We
Then
just
I have
trying
another
to accommodate us.
Okay, let me finish. So I wanted you to answer the question of what are the productive gains of a well-funded education sector. In terms of our budget, how does it look like when it comes to the taxes or when it comes to fuel prices, and also what can we expect in terms of taxes on alcohol and tobacco products? Okay, let me just give other people a chance. This one I was asked later.
Thank you so much. Shall we take 2 more questions and then we will return to our panelists to address those. Okay, you've got the microphone.
Yes. Sorry, good evening. My name is Aina, and my question is for Floris. So you spoke about unlisted investments, right, with pension funds. So now I think it goes back to what Jesaya said earlier, that in Namibia, your biggest employer is the government, right? So which means JPF is your biggest pension fund that you have in the country. Now, over the years, we have really seen the investment of JPF back in the Namibian market. And we have seen that they sponsor a lot of like things in Namibia, like I think Osona is one of them and all those type of things. Now, we don't really have the necessary skills to actually, how do we measure, because we don't really have the people with the necessary skills to measure how much of this unlisted are we bringing back to JPF, right? And how does this investment of JPF, because it feels like it's either the government that sponsors or it's JPF that gives the capital. How does that help the economic direction of the country? And is that the correct direction to go?
The gentleman, thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is David. I'm from the Business Association. Briefly, my question goes to our elder, Mr. Floris. If you were the Minister of Finance, sorry to put you on the spot, my elder, which economic direction or which sector will you put much of your budget on, and what will be the expected outcome on that? Just your view or your wisdom on that. Thank you.
I think what you, Salomo, can we go back to that question, the first one, and then we'll tackle the last 2 for you, Floris, and then we'll take 2 final questions from the floor.
Okay, thank you, Roche. I think Mahano spoke about the youth unemployment and the attachments. I think she answered her own question. It's really to link the pipeline to the production base. And I think Vitalo, the freelance philosopher. So we did the numbers on education. We looked at the number of people that start at grade 1. And if you have 60,000 young people starting grade 1 in a specific year, you only have around less than 10,000 that actually make it out of grade 12. That was 2 years ago that we did that study. So surely the long-term investment there does not carry any sort of lens that I'm looking at it. I think it's straightforward for everyone to see that somewhere along the line young people are falling through the cracks, they're simply not making it. The biggest dropout is around the grade 8 and grade 10. And that's the reality. So surely there's no productive gain if you are losing so many young people during that stage. We can go further. Again, you saw the slide where the greatest concentration of unemployment lies, and 9 out of 10 graduates are essentially young people. So to that extent we have spent so much on education, and even if we improve that number from the 60,000 that starts grade 1, taking them into grade 12, that would be a productive gain. And the other one was, actually I think this is it, David asked About, I know GIPF, I mean, again, Floris, to your point that we shouldn't rely on government to solve all our problems. Perhaps you are right in that respect. But the reality is that in the Namibian economy, where government is prevalent and where there's government support, whether it's GIPF, social security, there is some level of progress. So you need that support in one way or the other. And especially for a developing economy, you need to have government create that environment to have the private sector, the fund managers, managing mandates out of GIPF because of this big pool of assets that sits in there. I think those were really the questions there.
Thank you, Salomo. Floris, can we move over to you?
Can I add to that unlisted question of Ainu? Yeah? If I speak from our own book as Capricorn Asset Management, we are running an unlisted fund without any GIPF money in it. So I don't know if it's a two-edged sword, whether you actually want it or not, but we are cutting our teeth on it, and I think we're doing quite well. It is a debt fund, so we lend money. So we do not take equity stakes. There are other unlisted managers that does that. And yes, I think GIPF is probably now approaching close to 200 billion in assets. They're very close. Yeah, they are a huge player, and I think some of the structure we have currently in place in the unlisted environment was due to GIPF's boo-boos in the past, where they made mistakes, lost money, all that. So it was brought more formally, regulations, formal, register, do it proper. So it works, it's working. But I'm not big enough, but it's getting there. The other question was that if I was the minister, oh my goodness. Yes, like, I think we must rather conclude the evening, then I'll start. No, I will just continue to say no. What I will focus on, if I have to pick one sector, is agriculture. Agriculture is where the people, most of our people are employed, semi-employed, I would say, employed, commercial, subsistence. I think it's been said that up to 70% of our people are dependent on agriculture. So that is where you can make the biggest difference, the quickest in the quality of lives of people on the ground if you do that proper.
Thank you, Floris. We'll take one final question from the floor. We've got a question here in front. If we can just have the microphone.
Yeah. Thank you, Gideon Shinobu, ONL Group. I have 3 quick questions. One is to Mr. Hay. When you talk about inclusive growth, some people can have many interpretations, they can understand it differently. Maybe you need to just elaborate more and especially explaining the growth which is not inclusive and the one which is inclusive, so that it's clear to the layperson. 2, is now not the time where government should not look at where to spend the money, but should decide where not to spend the money. 3, Namibia is asset rich, but maintenance poor. So and you mentioned the example of Negatal Dam, new capital project, and every year we have from Bergh here, which we almost ran out of water. We went to invest that side and that water is not utilized, and we could have deployed maybe that capital much better close here. So I'm not sure whether I remember correctly, but I think I heard about the aspirations to build either 2 or 3 new big hospitals by the current administration. But we sit with big hospitals which requires good maintenance. So should we not park some of these capital expenditures and focus on doing proper maintenance for the assets which we have and we have neglected over time? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shilongo. I think I agree with you on the asset-rich component. Even if you look at our CBD, I always make a point that when cities thrive, their CBD is functioning. And that's a maintenance issue. We have neglected that component of maintenance. We tend to want new. On your way to Hobabas, there's a small town, a small village called Flay. There used to be an abattoir that was certified to export meat into the EU. It's decaying right in front of our eyes. If you go past there, you see baboons in there. They have established, I think, a coal factory next to it. So think about the health and safety issues around that abattoir. So those are low-hanging fruits that we can try and address to be able to create the jobs around the new Minister of Finance for Agriculture. And he spoke about. So those are, in fact, real, tangible sort of assets that we can look at. Again, maybe as part of the conversation, the maintenance around our asset base. I think the Ministry of Works was very stern last week around the government properties, where people stay for free, precisely because he wants to make sure that there's the return. In respect of inclusive growth, now GDP is measured on economic actors, those that are participating in the economy. So those that are, in a sense, meaningfully employed everywhere. And that's how it's measured. So when you measure that growth, and if the majority of those people in the economy are smaller than those outside of the economy that you are measuring, it means that the growth that you are measuring is not inclusive. What is it that we need to do? If you look at the structure of the economy, I spoke about it, that it has not changed. If you look at it from the 1980s to what it looks like now. Our secondary sector, and I think Helena or Jesaya spoke to this as well, is where jobs would be created. This is where value addition should take place. Again, to your point on maintenance, you produce with the green schemes this number of carrots for the market, where the carrots then is flooded in the market, for lack of a better word. What do you do next? Because that's a primary product. You bring it into the secondary sector, which means that you start adding value. You make carrot juice, you make carrot cake, you make carrot jam, That's secondary sector. And this is where the jobs will be created.
Saying Salomo, it's the first time we hear of carrot jam.
Apricot jam. But nevertheless, so essentially, this is how then the growth become inclusive, because you would have to employ more people that are standing on the assembly line to peel the carrot so that the carrot is clean, to wash it so that it can be grated, so that they turn into juice. So that becomes a value chain, and that's then you'll be able to employ. And I think the majority of people that heard me speak over the years that we've been doing this work that we are doing, I tend to think that I always say the same thing, and I don't change the audience. You know, I say this even when the president is in the room. You know, so the reality is that I don't know why the message doesn't land, because some of this really is low-hanging fruits. You know, we don't have to become highly complex with the job creation initiatives. In agriculture is there. We've got water. I don't know who owns the land next to Neckarton Dam. We have seen the success of the grape story down south in Southern Cape. They're exporting huge tonnage of grapes into the UK. You go there, for you guys that get the Schengen visas, go to London. You go to London, you see Namibian grapes in London because it's highly sought after product. What is the point? Why don't we replicate that into the other sides to create those jobs? So that's what inclusive growth would entail. I think there was a question around, is it time for government to decide what not to spend on or what to spend on? I think it's time for government to put skin in the game in terms of prioritizing this policy certainty. If they're going to transform, let's transform. If we're going to focus on agriculture, let's have that value chain fully optimized. Let's build those incentives. Do we understand the price variations in terms of the export market and the domestic demand? So that you've got a clear understanding of what it is that you want to see at the end of the day. In the absence of that, we'll just say from economic progression, advancement, transformation, and.
Thank you, Salomo. Thank you to our audience as well. In conclusion, I'd like to ask my panelists, if the minister were to be seated here tonight, what is the one hard decision you would urge her not to avoid? Jesaya? I think you've still got voice left.
So the question is, what?
So if the minister was here tonight, what is the one hard decision you would urge her not to avoid?
It's a difficult one. But I think, look, where we are right now in this country, I think what we need to do is not perhaps more policy. What we need to do is implementation, right? So what we need to do really, perhaps the hard decision is to hold to account the officials that are responsible for implementation in this country. Because we have, I believe we have some of the best policy in Africa, but our issue is implementation. So let's get that right. If we need to perhaps, the public sector is bloated, right? If we have to fire a few people, let's do that to get it right, and perhaps spark some fear in people to get it right. Because I think that's just, to me, the most, one thing that perhaps she should fear not doing if she has the power that needs to do so.
Jesaya says implementation. Helena?
I agree with Jesaya, and I would say implementation, but also not being afraid to say no to operational expenditure that is unnecessary, because sometimes, to Jesaya's point, it's not that we need more money, we just need to use what we have more efficiently. So holding people accountable to that and simply saying we're not going to allocate this because we do need to spend a little bit on the development and we have to make do with what we have, even though it might upset some people. I think it is important to manage the operational side, and even if it means a little bit, not necessarily going through with all of the jobs that they wanted to initially hire now today, it does mean that in a few years you'll be in a much better position to hire more people for a much longer time and at a much higher income.
Floris, you've been asked what if you were to be minister, but we'll let you off the hook on that one for now. If the minister had to be present, what would you say to her?
I would wish, what you say, Honorable Minister, I would just say, Honorable Minister, I wish you all the best and good luck.
Plain and simple, as easy as that. Salomo?
So the budget is a budget policy statement, right? And I come back to it. I think we have to transform the economy, ladies and gentlemen. That's the one thing we have to do. And with transformation comes hard decisions. And I think if there's one thing that we have learned from the current president is that she makes decisions, right? Whether we are happy with it or not, it's something else. And I hope that if I could speak to Madam Honorable Shafuda, I would ask her that please make a decision on this policy around investment and promotion so that everyone knows what they are signing up for, so that Namibians knows by 20% in oil is secured or it's not secured.